there, VisualPolitik community, we have realised a serious oversight. For more than 7 years, we have been releasing videos every week about the most diverse places and topics. However, in all that time, we have forgotten one country, Portugal. But that ends today. Known for its famous navigators and explorers such as Vasco da Gama and Ferdinand Magellan. Centuries ago, Portugal became the largest empire in Europe. That was until the Crown of Castile reached America. Yet these days, it is among the most backward countries in Western Europe. In fact, this is a circumstance it shares with its southern Mediterranean siblings, Spain and Greece. And it is certainly nothing new either. Portugal's history is a history plagued by instability and many crises. Without going any further, we have just recently learned of the resignation of its prime minister, who is being investigated for corruption.
The dignity of the duties of a prime minister are not compatible with any suspicion about integrity, good behavior, and even less with any kind of criminal act. Antonio Costa, former prime minister of Portugal.
In fact, as you will see, in recent decades, resignations have become almost a national sport in this country. Of course, it's not all bad, but do you know what its history teaches us? Especially the most recent events, that with hard work, you can get out of any tight spot. In fact, for many, Portugal has become a clear role model for dealing with new crises. We could even say that the terrible financial crisis of 2008 that shook the whole world finally put the batteries into a lethargic Portugal. Of course, in the last year, we have also seen news stories like this.
Thousands of people demonstrate against high cost of living.
So just when it seemed that Portugal was beginning to overcome all its major problems, 2023 has dumped another bucket of cold water on it. And so we on VisualPolitik have been asking ourselves a few questions. How did Portugal become an economic rising star? What was the price it had to pay for it? Why are the protesters, once again, taking to the streets of the country? Today we are going to answer all these questions. And we are going to do it with Jake, the new member of the VisualPolitik team. Take it away, Jake.
Into the abyss.
Many, if not all of you, already know that when World War II ended, fascism did not disappear from Europe. At least, not completely. And yes, I imagine many of you are probably thinking of Francisco Franco, the Spanish dictator who was in power for 36 years. However, did you know that despite lasting for almost 40 years, this was not the longest dictatorship in Western Europe? To find the longest lasting one, we have to take a closer look at today's protagonist, Portugal. The Portuguese dictatorship that began in 1926 became the longest lasting in all of Western Europe. Its leading figure, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, an economist who began as finance minister to the dictator Oscar de Fragoso Carmona, became the dictatorship's first minister in 1932. His project, the Estado Novo, or New State, prioritized order over the new economy, which meant a lot of censorship and also the imprisonment of many activists and political opponents. Despite this, he at least managed to keep the country's economy afloat, albeit at much lower rates of development than those throughout the rest of Europe. In any case, after being incapacitated after suffering an embolism in 1968, the dictatorship would see its last years under Salazar's successor, Marcelo Caetano, who had to deal with the nationalist movements in the Portuguese colonies in Africa and also with the 1973 crisis. So, what was the result? In the end, after 48 years, the dictatorship fell after the uprising of armed forces officers in April 1974. This movement became known as the Carnation Revolution. However, from that moment on, Portugal launched down a murky path full of short presidencies until 1986, when, along with Spain, it joined the European Economic Community. That was a real turning point. For the next 20 years, the Portuguese economy grew at a rate of almost 3% per year. It wasn't cause for wild celebration, but it was a 180-degree turnaround. Portugal, like countries such as Spain, experienced a huge spiral of wealth and modernization. Nevertheless, in 2008, tragedy struck.
1 December 2008. It's official. Recession since December 2007. 14 December 2008, Eurozone enters recession for first time in history.
On our sister channel, VisualPolitik, we have already told you about the origin of this crisis and how it swept the financial system and took down banks like Lehman Brothers. But for today's country, the situation was even worse. In 2008, the Portuguese economy not only saw its own real estate bubble burst and its economy begin to collapse, but within a few years, a huge public debt crisis was also unleashed. The Portuguese state, already far more indebted than the European Union average, suddenly had to take on massive amounts of debt. In 2012, just 4 years after the outbreak of the crisis, public debt already exceeded 120% of GDP. As you can see, the problem was quite similar to that which occurred in most of southern Europe. The crisis was much bigger than anyone expected. The Portuguese government responded by trying to feed demand with more public spending, a kind of hypercaloric formula where instead of calories, you add debt, interest, and more debt. However, this approach was completely useless. In the end, the Prime Minister, José Sócrates, had no choice but to cut back because, plain and simple, the public coffers were completely empty. In a way, the country was unraveling. It was then that the key figure of the Portuguese recovery came to power, Pedro Passos Coelho. Passos Coelho, then leader of the conservative PSD, won the 2011 early elections by a wide margin. The Portuguese people chose him to carry out one mission: revive Portugal. In order to do so, the new government had to make a difficult decision, the same one that Greece and Ireland were forced to make: to accept the bailout from the European Commission and the International Monetary Fund. Specifically, Portugal received 78 billion euros, but on one condition: the country would have to embrace economic austerity. Coelho then began, in the darkest moments of the crisis between 2012 and 2013, to take the toughest decisions. For example, he cut spending on education, health, and economic affairs by 7%, drastically reduced redundancy protection at a time when unemployment was breaking records with levels of over 15%, and froze both the minimum wage at 500 euros as well as the salaries of civil servants. The question is, was it a smooth process? Not at all. As you can imagine, faced with such a scenario, what always happens in these cases occurred. Protesters began to flood the streets. In spite of everything, in 2014, after 3 long years of widespread economic suffering, the country began to see the light. It was, in any case, not an easy starting point.
16 May 2014, Portugal emerges from bailout poorer and still far from recovery.
But do you know what? From then on, Portugal was not only concerned about recovering completely, it also wanted to armour itself against future crises. What are we talking about? Well, let's get into that right now.
Developing muscle.
After bottoming out, the Portuguese economy started to grow again. It did so at a more leisurely pace of 2.3% on average between 2014 and 2019. But even so, unemployment managed to drop to just over 6%. And so, although Passos Coelho did not manage to renew his mandate, his government did manage to get the economic situation on track and prepare the foundations for the recovery. A recovery which, by the way, the current Prime Minister, the socialist Antonio Costa, later took credit for. As you know, there's nothing new under the sun. The fact is that the Coelho government not only reduced social spending, but also pushed for plans such as the Simplex program to reduce bureaucracy in the public administration. This measure was crucial in recovering FDI, for instance. Check it out. It also managed to start reducing public debt, which between 2014 and 2019 fell from 133% to 116%. We are not talking about any miracle here. As you can see, the crisis hit very hard, and the post-crisis data are nothing to write home about. But what can I say? Given the history of southern European countries, this change from inertia was exciting, to say the least. So let's just say that the achievement here is that the Portuguese government managed to stabilize things.
29 November 2018, Portugal repays to the IMF all loans from the 2011 financial bailout. The international organization lent more than $26 billion at 5.8% interest.
Stabilize things and also improve the country's own economic foundations. And pay attention, because this was key. Why? Well, because in 2020, the pandemic arrived. And this time, Portugal was not among the stragglers, but among the leaders. In 2020, its economy fell by more than 8%, but in the following 2 years, it grew by 5% and 6% respectively. And not only that, the country managed, despite everything, to further reduce public debt to 113% in 2022. In other words, in 2022, Portugal's public debt ratio was lower than it had been in 2019. VisualPolitik viewers, for many analysts, Portugal has become a kind of role model, at least a realistic, attainable, imitable example. Thanks to tax incentives, regulatory improvements, and an active attraction for foreign investments, unemployment these days is relatively low. The economy is growing and its macro parameters are improving. But unfortunately, this is not the whole story.
Tourism and investment equals crisis.
Remember when we told you that Collor reduced bureaucracy so that Portugal would receive more foreign investments? Well, as you can imagine, this was not the only measure he took to attract foreign investors. Collor realised that he could get a 2-for-1 if he played his cards right. Not only did he have the opportunity to attract more investment, but also to fight one of the country's biggest challenges, growing demographic ageing. Yes, Portugal is also one of those countries that is set to have very complicated decades ahead of them. The population over 60 years of age now accounts for almost 30% of the total population, a percentage that will continue to grow steadily over the next few years. Well, the fact is that Passos Collor introduced 2 controversial measures intended to attract investment while reducing demographic pressure. Collor introduced the famous golden visas and startup visas. Check it out. Introduced in 2012, the Golden Visas granted residency to foreigners in exchange for an investment of €500,000 or $535,000. In their first 7 years, they managed to raise more than $3.4 billion thanks to the arrival of thousands of investors with stratospheric incomes from China, Russia, the United States, and several Arab nations who wanted to enjoy a residency and even the possibility of obtaining European nationality, while enjoying the significant tax breaks that this scheme granted them. The startup visa was prompted to attract founders and companies that could present projects with the potential to reach a value of €325,000 or an annual turnover of more than €500,000 within 3 years. Although it did not grant the possibility of accessing Portuguese nationality, it did have the tax benefits that also applied to the golden visas, which is why the creation of startups in the country skyrocketed to the point of leading entrepreneurial improvement throughout Europe. VisualPolitik community, it is undeniable that these visas were able to help boost foreign investment. However, all that glitters is not gold. These visas not only brought foreign money into Portugal, but also helped fuel a new crisis, the housing crisis. You see, with the economic recovery, the zero interest rate monetary policy, and also the international visa scheme, the price of housing in Portugal has skyrocketed. For example, in Lisbon, the capital, the average price for renting an apartment is already around €2,000. That's around $2,100. This alone shouldn't be a problem. In fact, depending on where you live, it may sound pretty good. However, remember at the beginning of the video how Portugal was almost last in per capita income in Western Europe. Yep, that's the problem. Portugal has a GDP per capita of around €24,000 and a minimum wage of €760. Now, do you think that with those income levels, Portuguese people can afford a rent of €2,000 in Lisbon? The truth is that it's complicated.
Often, beneficiaries of tax-free programs, such as golden visas, remodel a house, but do not occupy it. Many times, those properties are sold again and again, and that creates distortion in the real estate market and is one of the causes of the housing crisis. Luis Mendez, geographer and housing researcher, in an interview to BBC Mundo, 30 May 2023.
Of course, the lack of housing has more to do with land and construction regulation than with visas, but this model has contributed to skyrocketing housing prices, and it has not even been the only ingredient that has contributed to worsening the situation. Tourism has also had a lot to do with it. In cities like Porto, for example, houses designed for temporary visitors, that is, tourist apartments, already account for 4 out of 10 dwellings in the city. So the Portuguese locals are struggling to find affordable apartments to live in. Obviously, in countries where supply is limited, if demand grows, prices skyrocket. And that explains news items like this.
1 April 2023, thousands protest in Portugal over housing crisis.
So what was the outcome? Well, the government of the socialist Antonio Costa began to take measures. For example, it established a 2% cap on price increases in new rental contracts and even promoted the obligation to rent private housing that was empty. Look, this is what the initial bill presented by the Portuguese Socialist Party said.
Landlords will have 100 days from receipt of a rental proposal from municipal authorities to re-rent a vacant property in a habitable condition. Housing bill presented to the public in March 2023.
Under this project, homeowners would be required to inform local authorities if a property became vacant. The local authorities would then be able to make rental proposals. And if the process lasted more than 100 days and the housing was still empty, the municipalities could rent it forcibly at the price they themselves set. They would then sublet the properties to other people as public housing. In the end, however, this measure was more diluted. In the law ultimately approved by Parliament, it applies only to properties that have been vacant for more than 2 years and are located in coastal areas. Even so, it sets a clear precedent. I can already tell you that investors would not like it one bit. And that's not all. The new housing regulation has also established hard limits to tourist apartments, including a new extraordinary tax of 15%. And not surprisingly, the Golden Visa program has also been eliminated. We're therefore talking about one of the most radical housing policy approaches ever seen in all of Europe. And that is precisely what explains this news headline.
21 August 2023, President of the Republic vetoes Mas Vivienda program.
Of course, in Portugal, the presidential veto is not definite. The law went back to Parliament, which approved it, and the law came into force at the beginning of October. Even so, many Portuguese citizens are skeptical that this plan will become established. Why? For one simple reason. Portugal is in the midst of a deep political crisis. Since Costa managed to revalidate his post in the 2022 elections with an absolute majority, he has had to deal with 12 resignations of senior officials of his government due to various scandals, something that earned him 2 motions of censure by the right-wing bloc. And if that wasn't enough, we came across the surprising news we mentioned at the beginning of the video.
Antonio Costa, Prime Minister of Portugal, resigns after being investigated in corruption case.
Indeed, the latest information suggests that it was an error by the Portuguese prosecution that confused the Minister of Economy, Antonio Costa Silva, with the Prime Minister, Antonio Costa. So it seems there is no case against the former Prime Minister. Even so, you can see the enormous political instability that exists. So we are almost back to square one. Portugal has improved some things, but just when it seemed to be betting on a business attraction model, it's suddenly taken a new turn in the opposite direction. That's the thing about Latin countries. They tend to fix scratches with more cannon shots. In any case, this is the story of how Portugal managed to become one of the latest European rising stars. The question is, will it manage to remain so? Will Portugal manage to fight the housing crisis without ruining the national economy? And what would you do to combat this problem? Leave us your impressions in the comments and let's start a debate. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. All the best, and see you next time.